Partners in Ministry, a presentation of Josiah White's Quakerdale Foundation, dedicated to growing ministry support networks, introducing people to a cause that connects with their heart, bringing hope and encouragement to our communities as we seek together to serve as Christ served.
Welcome. My name's Dan Smith, and today I'll be talking with Colin Saxton. Colin is the Advancement Officer and Director of North American Ministries of Friends United Meeting. Today's interview is divided into two segments. In the first segment, we'll have a general discussion about generous congregations and the best practices for financial stewardship and generosity. In the second segment, we'll dive deeper into narrative budgets. Welcome, Colin, and thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Dan. It's great to be here.
On December 12th, you held a virtual workshop titled Generous Congregations, Best Practices in Financial Stewardship and Generosity. Today, I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about generous congregations. And then after that, let's dive a little bit deeper into narrative budgets, okay?
Okay.
All right, so here we go. Let's talk about generous congregations. Now, you stated previously that cultivating generosity is an essential piece to individual and communal faithfulness. Why is that?
Well, I've been thinking a lot recently about a couple of texts found in Scripture. One's Matthew chapter 6 and one's Luke chapter 11. And in those passages, Jesus is talking about how the eye is the lamp of the body, and if our eye is full of light, our whole body will be full of light. And that it's really a focus on learning to have a sense of single-minded devotion or purity of heart. Trapped within those texts is the sense one of the fruits of that reality is generosity of spirit, not just with our finances, but it comes out in the Greek language that that's the fruit of single-minded devotion to God is generosity in the way we use our time, our talents, our wealth, how we show hospitality and grace and mercy to others. And so I just think it's a really important part of our spiritual life. And it's not, Jesus ties it in the Matthew 6 chapter in relationship to money as well. And he's not talking about balancing those two out. He's talking about how is money integrated into our devotion to God. And I think too often we think about stewardship and finances and generosity as a simple transaction. We write a check or we put some money in the offering plate. And really it's about the transformation of our lives, about how we more fully reflect the heart of Jesus to the world.
Sure. So if I'm hearing you, what you're saying here is that the communal faithfulness you're talking about is not from the loyalty standpoint of when you think about faithfulness, it's rather living a life of faith. In other words, generosity helps us live out that life of faith that God intends for us to live if we cultivate that. Is that kind of where you're coming from?
Absolutely, on both the individual basis, but also that kind of communal or corporate basis. Because again, I think that when we talk about being a congregation, the church, it's about incarnating the presence of God and of Christ in the world, of continuing his ministry. And stewardship is not about managing assets or meeting a budget. It's about, are we living into the life that God has called us to? And that's where our devotion to God and generosity really work together.
Yeah. I remember when I was at Wheaton College, one of my New Testament professors challenged us that as we went through the course for that quarter, as we're reading scriptures, how does it reflect on generosity? It really opened my eyes that almost everything that God was saying through Jesus or the apostles were saying had some sort of trace of generosity in it. I mean, it was just like full of it. And I never really seen it that much before. But when you think about it, God is generous. He is Absolutely. The most generous being that ever existed. And if we're supposed to be made in his image, it would kind of go to conclusion that there must be some of that in us too then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think right now is an important time for the church to focus on this, because if you look at giving patterns in the last number of years, last year, for instance, in the US, people gave $485 billion to charity, which sounds like a great thing. 27% of that money went to congregations and denominations, which all seems great. That's about $135 billion. But if you look at over the last 40 years, the share of giving to churches has gone from about 60% to 27% of the total amount of money that's given. Some of that's because of decline in church attendance, but also because I think churches we've not continued to learn about how it is that we give and why we give and how essential it is to carrying out God's work in the world.
Yeah. Now, I know a few days back you had this virtual conference on this very topic about generosity, uh, financial stewardship, and so forth. So, can you kind of give us some of the highlights of that talk so that if people really are interested in learning more, they can use the link that we put on this thing and go a little bit deeper. So, best practices briefly. What are some of the things we need to know about that part of generosity?
Right. So this is actually a workshop that is a partnership between Everence Financial and the Lake Institute. And so it comes out of a really well put together program that's offered. It's a 2-day workshop. And I've narrowed it down to about a 90-minute workshop for the work that I do with Friends United meeting. And so I've sort of focused on about 6 things that I think are really essential for best practices. The first is mission clarities. Do we know who we are, what we're called to do as a congregation? In my experience over the last 30 plus years traveling among congregations, the biggest frustration I hear among members of churches is we don't really know who we are, what we're supposed to be doing. And so focusing on that, becoming really crystal clear about that is essential. And not just as something we put on our website or a banner on our wall, but we've really integrated that into our life together and how we express our ministry. A second, we're going to talk about this a little bit later, is a narrative budget. Is how do we turn that sort of line item list of expenditures into a picture, into a story that people can get excited about, something that invites us into a fuller sense of participation in what God is calling us to do. A third piece is practicing that work of storytelling. How do we communicate who we are in a concise, clear, consistent, and compelling way to people around us? As we think about inviting people into a life with Jesus, we're also inviting them into a life within his body and within a particular congregation. Well, how do we do that in ways that are effective for both people who attend, but also people who might attend? Expressing thanks is a significant piece of, in congregations, in my experience, we don't do this very well, especially in relation to how nonprofits go about doing it. Years ago, I ran a campaign for a nonprofit, and we did a study to make sure that we were ready to do the campaign. And one of the things they expressed about our nonprofit is we did a great job of telling people thank you. And several people in the study said, I wish my congregation would tell me thank you every once in a while. We just never hear that. Maybe we get a year-end letter, but how can congregations learn how to appreciate the generosity of their supporters in ways that is meaningful to them? A fifth area that I think is important is having a focus around cultivating generosity, not just our financial resources, but our time, our talents, our focus, the whole way in which we live our life. If you look at ways that there's generational differences in the way people express generosity. And for every generation, giving money is not the top thing. There are other ways in which they think are more essential, more important ways to be generous. And so how do we develop that within people in ways that are transformational for their lives? Especially since if you want to cultivate generosity in young people, you do it through example. And so how do we pair young people with older people who are generous so that they're learning these kinds of things? And a part of that, Dan, to me, that generosity is learning to be able to handle our finances in ways that are manageable. If you talk to young people nowadays, they're really concerned about paying off college debt, paying for a home, having enough money for a down payment. Can I afford to ever have a child? Older people are concerned about what to do with their resources. Are they going to have enough at the end of their lives? And so helping people manage those things is really, really crucial so that they have the stability to be generous. And I think congregations are in a unique position to be able to do that kind of work with people as an aspect of discipleship. And then the last piece that I would just simply add is thinking about stewardship in a holistic year-round way. Creating structures and strategies for stewardship is not something we do 1 week a year or one special Sunday a year. It's needed. You need to create a team of people who have a sense of calling and passion and gift to do this well within a congregation's life.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that is a great overview. I know that there's a lot more detail that we can find from that workshop. That's why we put the link to that in our show notes here on the website as well as the description of the YouTube video. So I really would invite you, if you have any interest in learning more about this, or you'd like to go a little bit deeper in terms of what Colin's talking about, to take a look at that. It's free. There's no obligation to it. It's right there for you. So I want to thank you for making that available, Colin. Really appreciate it. If you'd like to learn more about generous congregations or financial stewardship, I just invite you to look at the show notes for this episode again, or like I said, in the description of this YouTube video. Now, we're going to take a little short 5-minute break. And when we come back, we're going to talk deeper about this thing called a narrative budget. So thanks for joining me. I hope to see you on the other side. Welcome back to Diving Deeper. Now, in this segment, we're going to take a closer look at narrative budgets. Now, narrative and budget, I got to admit that that's not two words you see together very often. So we're going to need some explanation here. So what exactly is a narrative budget?
So when we think about a budget, we think about something like this. A list of priorities and expenditures. And for 97% of us, our eyes glaze over immediately. We think, I don't even know what that's trying to tell me. Or we get together in a business meeting when you focus on a particular line, like this one down here says software. This year it's being raised $900. Why on earth do we need $900 more dollars of expense? And then we'll spend the next 2 hours arguing about whether that's a useful expense, rather than talking about what it is that this budget is actually reflecting. What's the story? What are the leading priorities of how God is going to take those resources and our shared sense of calling and passion and to put them into use in a way that's making a transformational difference in our community? So what a narrative budget tries to do is to use pictures and to use stories to tell what a congregation is doing. It can be a simple one-page sort of thing, or it can be an expanded document like this one that a church put together. A congregation that says, our vision is to become a vibrant community of transformed people committed to sharing the life-giving power of Jesus with the world, right? That's a compelling mission. And they do it in a few specific ways. They've got 7 priorities in this particular congregation: discipleship, community outreach, corporate worship, community, children's ministry, service, and cross-cultural mission. And then what the budget does over the next several pages is sort of outlines that. It describes what's going to happen, for instance, in our children's ministry. How's the work of our staff or volunteers going to make an internal difference in the life of these young people? So what a narrative budget does is it takes those numbers, those accounting numbers that we have to have. We'll continue to use those because we want to keep track of income and expenditures. But we want to paint a picture of what's going to happen over the next 12 months that people can get excited about and participate in.
Okay. So most of the time when we look at a budget, it has a tendency to just talk about the story of what we have, what we don't have, and what we're not going to be able to accomplish, and how red is, and what there's black. That's praise the Lord. And that's about the end of it. Whereas a narrative budget sounds to me like, from what I'm gaining from you here, is that it's more about, remember why we're here, who we are, what we're trying to accomplish. And it's our belief as leadership that this budget will help us get here and be able to accomplish these things. Is that kind of a good way to summarize that?
That's a huge piece of it, right? It's a way to inspire and invite people into something. The three reasons people give typically to a congregation or nonprofit is, the third most important reason is there's transparency. I know that if I give money to my local church, they're going to use it as I say. The second most important reason is I trust the leadership. But the most important, compelling reason that people give is because they feel a sense of attachment and connection to the mission of the organization. A line item budget doesn't inspire that sense of attachment. But if I have a greater understanding, a really deep understanding, and an invitation to be a partner in what God is going to do through our congregation this year, that heightens typically people's sense of excitement. I want to give because I know how the Holy Spirit is going to work through us in the coming year.
Sure. Yeah. So instead of giving out of my excess, it's kind of like, I want to be a part of that. So I'm going to go ahead and maybe make a cut here, make a cut there, and take that money I normally would spend somewhere else. I'm going to give it to the mission of the church because I really believe that that's where we want to go. That's what I'd like to see happen then.
Right. And so in the best form, what a narrative budget provides is an opportunity for the congregation to be a part of that planning cycle, because we don't just set it and forget it. It's not just a document that we create and isn't that nice, and now we tuck it in a file. But we've invited people to be a part of discerning what God has called us to do. And then we take that budget and we use it throughout the year to remind people. So if, for instance, we have 6 priorities in our congregation, what I might do if I'm the pastor, if I'm the stewardship leader in my church, is every month we might highlight one of those areas and tell people, here's what we accomplished so far in this year in the area of community outreach, for instance. Here's a story of somebody's lives being changed. Maybe it's something that we rotate through our website so that we continue to keep those images and those stories in front of people to remind them throughout the year. The reality of it is that most newcomers, and they're looking for a congregation, the first place they go is to a church's website to find out what is their mission and how are they actually living that out. You're telling that story with consistency on your web platform or through your social media or through your church newsletter. You have a way of reinforcing that life together and continuing to invite people in.
Yeah. Well, it sounds to me like a narrative budget could be one of those things that you would put in places where you normally wouldn't put a regular budget. In other words, it's going to be, I would think it would be much more visible than just the plain numbers.
Absolutely. When I work with congregations around creating one, I talk to them about how might you use this. Let's think creatively about all the ways you could use this narrative budget. Maybe it's something you give to newcomers, not because you're trying to get them to give right away, because you want them to understand the depth and ministry that this community is actually living out. Maybe it becomes part of your membership class. It certainly becomes part of your committee's work to remind them of, as we now are planning for this year and for future years, these are the priorities that we've set, presumably because God has led us to focus on throughout the year. And so it helps us remember what we can say, what we should be saying yes to in terms of ministry, and what we need to not say yes to, because it's really outside of our focus.
Yeah. Yeah. I could see this really transforming the conversations that are going to happen at a congregational meeting or a business meeting, instead of just talking about the pluses or the minuses as far as money is concerned. All of a sudden, so how did we do at accomplishing what we wanted to do the first quarter? What do we need to do it a little bit better? What stood in the way? What could we do and so now it ends up being a time for people to come together to say, all right, let's move from first quarter to second quarter, but let's be even more successful at the ministry God's called us to, rather than just how can we get people to give more?
Right, exactly. Because typically with a light item budget, what happens is that at the end of the year, we go, too bad, we were $5,000 short. Or we have this, celebration because we were $45 over. And because we think the goal is to meet the budget. That's not the goal. The goal is to carry out the work that God has called us to do. And I think a structure or a vehicle like this helps us do what you've just said, is to remain focused on monitoring. Are we being faithful? Are we continuing to risk, to give, to invest in what God has called us to do?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I as a newcomer to a church, if I was sitting into a business meeting and that was the kind of conversation was going to go, first I'd have to pick my jaw up and go, what did I just see? Because this is not a normal church setting here. These guys are really, really serious about doing something for the gospel and for people and for community.
Yeah.
And take it seriously.
It also helps us reframe some really important parts of our life together too. Often we think, we often complain people don't want to pay for the lights to be on, or we don't want to pay for building maintenance. Built into this narrative budget is the amount of expenditure for the facility, for instance, gets carried over into each of those areas. It becomes part of the ministry and the mission, just as the staff does. We divide staff time in each of those areas, reflective of this is a total ministry project or a mission project, including staff, facility, expenses we might make to carry out particular programs, but it's working all together to help facilitate the work that God has called us to do. We don't treat staff and facility as if they're administrative or overhead costs. You talk to any pastor, they're not administration, they're not overhead. Their work is integrated into the ministry.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I can also see where this would also be very, very encouraging for me to see where I fit. what role I could have, or how I could put forth some of my talents or my time, and really not only make a difference in the ministry, but it would also have an indirect result on the budget as well.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. That is great. So I'm a new pastor. I'm coming into a church. I want to present this whole idea of narrative budget. What is the best way for me to try to incorporate this in my financial reporting? How would you advise me as a new pastor of a congregation to introduce this whole concept to my congregation?
Yeah. That's a great question, because often people look at that and they go, "Oh man, that's too much work. We don't want to do that. We just want to look at last year's budget and decide whether we should raise it or lower it." So what this really requires, the way we structure it with the workshops that we do, is we invite a cohort of people from the congregation. Get some of the pastors invited, some of the other stewardship leaders, and we bring together people to talk about, to build a sense of critical mass and momentum, to be able to go back and come up with an implementation plan that begins moving a congregation in this direction. You don't have to go from 0 to 60 in 5 seconds, but how can we take some next right steps over the next 30 days, 60 days, year, that moves us to a place, maybe using the narrative budget as an example, so that we're actually integrating this now. It becomes part of the new normal for our church. It usually means finding some creative people to be involved in this. Again, another way of getting newcomers or other gifted people involved in stewardship concerns. Typically, because when we think about recruiting people for our stewardship team, we want number crunchers and budgeters. This needs other kinds of people. This needs design people, creative people, folks who have that capacity to see the big picture. And so it often means a change in terms of the composition of your stewardship team.
Sure.
A first step that I often encourage churches to do is to mock up one based on last year. If you were to look at what you actually did last year, how would you describe the work of your church, putting a narrative budget together that reflected what you did last year? Just to kind of give you some practice thinking about that. How would you divide your finances? How would you name what those few priorities are? How would you tell the story of what actually happened as a launching pad to then say, now let's think about this aspirationally or for the future of how do we now invite people into what we hope God will do through us?
Sure. Yeah. And at the center of all this is we're praising God for what Christ has done through us in the past. And we're anticipating with great fulfillment and excitement what he's looks like he's going to do through us in the future. And that's exciting.
Yeah. In some ways, I've seen churches take this and do a little bit of recap from last year, kind of like a nonprofit does an annual report.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what we accomplished. Now, this is what we get to do next year, God willing, and through everyone's partnership. And so it can be a really effective way to do that.
Sure. Yeah. I know one of the things that we try to do every quarter is we always thank people for their support of the foundation. But more importantly, we try to tell at least 2 stories of how God worked because of the donation that you gave, allowed to transform some lives in the past. And here's what we're looking forward in the future. And I've gotten several responses back from people saying, I just feel like I'm really a part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's more than just giving of a money. It's my way of being a part of what God is doing through the organization or through the church in this case.
Yeah. And especially with young donors, for old guys like you and me, we gave money because we were challenged or we were committed, that sense of loyalty to an organization. Young people don't have that same sort of approach. They want to feel a sense of connection or a sense of making a significant contribution. They want to know how their money is actually making a difference in somebody's lives.
Yeah.
And if you're telling that story, that's a way for them to go, I want to be a part of that.
Exactly. Yeah. Ooh, I want to be a part of that. And then they'll either volunteer their time or their talent or their treasure because that's exciting.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, that is awesome. Well, Cole, I just really want to thank you for being my guest today. And we look forward to meeting again with you soon.
Thank you. I appreciate all the work you do. And thanks for the invitation.
You bet. Hey, if you got any questions, if you'd like to learn more about this narrative budget process or anything we've talked about today, again, Colin's contact information is right here on the screen. He'd love to visit with you. You can also find it in the show notes of this episode on our website, or like I said before, you can find it in the description of this YouTube video. So on behalf of Friends United Meeting, Colin Saxton and Partners in Ministry, I want to thank you for joining me today. And until next time, let's get out there and serve as Christ serves.
This has been a presentation of Partners in Ministry, a podcast of Josiah White's Quakerdale Foundation. To learn more and see the show notes for this and other episodes, visit our website. To stay informed of up and coming broadcasts, subscribe to our e-newsletter. To invest in our mission, donate today.